Item number 12 is the Local Government Electoral Legislation Bill, and I have Warwick McNaughton, who's going to lead that as our Principal Advisor. Rose Leonard, I think, is online as our Manager of Governance Services. I'm just going to, if I can arbitrarily ask a couple of people to move and second that. Maybe Angela, you'd like to move, and Pippa, you'd like to second. Pretty much it's to approve the submission to Parliament, and I'm predicting that we'll approve it because what we've asked for is largely what we've got. But there's also receiving the feedback from local boards, and probably the most prominent piece of feedback is an interest among a number of local boards that whether provision could be made for representation from Māori members at the local board level. But I think those submissions will be attached to our governing body submission and will speak for themselves. But Warwick, if you'd like to introduce the item at this point, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Tēnā koutou members. I came across an article in the Local Government magazine on Tuesday written by Linda O'Reilly, who's a lawyer and writes regularly for the magazine, and the article was about this particular bill. And she ends up saying, the bill's a sensible amalgam of the aspirational and pragmatic. It forces councils to address the area of Māori representation without compelling them to adopt Māori wards or constituencies, and it plugs a few holes in the Act. This is what sensible legislation looks like. And so, as His Worship has mentioned, the thrust of the submission is to recommend support for the bill. In the section in the report, which is headed Analysis and Advice, we stepped through the amendments to the various acts, and I thought I'd just traverse those very briefly. Firstly, the amendments to the Local Government Auckland Council Act, that removes the restriction on 20 councillors, which is something that we have been asking for some time. The amendments to the Local Electoral Act, firstly, Māori wards. The suggested provisions in the bill require a council, if it doesn't have Māori representation, to consider having it, but doesn't compel a council to have it. And prior to making that sort of consideration, must engage with Māori and other communities of interest in the district or region in accordance with Part 6 of the Local Government Act, and Part 6 sets out the requirements in terms of making decisions and consulting people and so on. For a council who has had Māori representation, there is no requirement to reconsider it, but a council may do if they wish. We've made a couple of what I'd call observations, if you like, in the submission. One observation is that the requirement to engage with Māori and other communities of interest, we're suggesting that the committee have a look at that wording. Communities of interest, that phrase is a phrase that is used elsewhere in the Act, the Local Electoral Act, for example. And one of the requirements when looking at representation reviews is to provide for effective representation of communities of interest. And the term communities of interest isn't defined in the Act, but there is comment about it in the guidelines that are published by the Local Government Commission. And we just wonder whether the meaning to communities of interest in those guidelines is what was intended when the bill was drafted. We understand that particular phrase was used to avoid confusion with simply saying Māori and the rest of the community, because the term community also has a certain meaning in the legislation in terms of community boards. The other observation that we make is that in contrast, say, to the Local Government Act, which has a Treaty of Waitangi section, the Local Electoral Act makes provision for Māori representation, but at the front of the Act does not have any sort of overarching purpose for that provision, and we're suggesting that's an omission, and that the Act would benefit from having something along those lines. Looking at the other changes in the Local Electoral Act, minor changes to local board boundaries as part of a representation review. The council expressed some concern back in 2015 when we were wondering whether we should do a representation review for the 2016 elections. And at that time, when Auckland Council, following Auckland Council being set up, ward boundaries coincided with local board boundaries, and in people's minds were very much the same, and we were a bit concerned that if boundaries got out of alignment, it would be confusing for people. So we actually raised this with the Department of Internal Affairs at the time. They felt it wasn't appropriate to take it up at that stage, and so this particular proposal is resurrecting that notion, that request that we made to them at the time. Over the years, though, and as a result of the 2019 representation review, I think ourselves and the community now accept that ward boundaries are simply electoral boundaries, and that the community must expect that they will change from time to time with population changes. But one of the results of ward boundaries and local board boundaries falling out of alignment is that it creates pockets where the misalignment occurs, where you actually have to publish different permutations of voting documents and so on. And if the misalignment was of a minor nature, it would be helpful to have this particular provision in the tool chest, so to speak, so that it could be used if it was appropriate at the time. The bill suggests that there will be a definition of what we might call minor transfer of population, which will be in regulations. From the 2019 representation review, the smallest change was around the Royal Oak area, and that was about 1,300 people involved. And I think that is what is being that sort of minor change is what is expected in terms of what will go into regulations. It would be my personal view that using this particular provision to change the Waitemata local board boundaries to align with the Waitemata and Gulf ward boundaries would be basically out of scope. That's too big a change. But the change that occurred around Royal Oak is possibly something that just simply could be simplified if it was possible to align the two boundaries. Further changes in the Local Electoral Act, ties and recounts. This addresses a problem that was faced in another council. A member was elected, declared elected. There was a recount, and as a result of the recount, the elected member became unelected and was replaced. The problem with what happened at the time was that the elected member had already been sworn in. So what the process that's being suggested here is that if there's a tie, the first thing to happen is the judicial recount rather than the other way around. And that's what happened in the situation I mentioned. The tie was decided by lot, and then there was a judicial recount which said that there wasn't actually a tie. So the proposal here is a judicial recount. If the recount ends in a tie, then it's decided by lot. Some changes to provisions for candidate nominations to allow for them to be made electronically, if that's what the electoral officer determines. And that's in line with requests we've made of government in the past that as much as possible of the election process should be electronic. The establishment or reorganisation of local board areas and unitary authority districts. We had noticed for some time prior that if we were to look at the reorganisation of local boards, the amalgamation of local boards, the abolishment of local boards, the establishment of new ones, they would have to be conducted under the Local Government Act using the process in Schedule 3. While that process in Schedule 3 did refer to local boards throughout, it made sense to actually have a separate process that just dealt with local boards and unitary authorities. and not have to have the wording that related to the things that territorial local authorities had to consider, like transition committees, transfer of assets, what you do with staff, and so on. Your Worship, I think that's a summation of the provisions in the bill. I would just say that the feedback from local boards is not all in. We're constrained by the submission process to the Select Committee, and the recommendation is that we add all the local board submissions to the Council submission. By and large, the local board submissions have been supportive.
Thank you very much, Warwick, and that was as thorough as always. The submissions close on the 14th of September, so we'll probably just we'll get our submission in before that date, but after we've got the feedback from local boards. Councillors will recognise that the attachments attachment A is the submission itself that we are asked to approve. B is the local board submissions. C is the bill itself, and D compares Schedule 3 and Schedule 3A, as Warwick has just explained. So these are decisions that we have made before. Any tidying up can be done by, I think, under the resolution by the Deputy Mayor and myself, and we'll present submissions if it occurs before the 8th of October. So I'll open it up for questions first. We've got a number of questions. First question is from Councillor Paul Young. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question might be not directly to today's topic, but it's related. Christchurch Council in some ward can be elect 2 councillors in the same ward, like my ward, Howick ward in Auckland. And my question is why they only allow the voters have a 1 vote only, which is only can choosing 1 councillor candidates in their ward in Christchurch and other cities. But we are in Auckland, we can have up to 2 votes, can choose the 2 councillors at the same time, such as the Albany ward, North Shore ward, Manukau ward. Why we have a difference, and we are both are local government? Can you explain, or if you have information? Thank you.
I'll get Warwick to answer that. I don't think the bill touches on that at all, but Warwick, you've probably got an answer off the top of your head that might help.
This relates to the representation review, which we're required to conduct at least every 6 years. And the options open to us actually in terms of the election of councillors. They can all be elected at large. They can be elected by ward. They can be elected by a combination of at large or by ward. And the council can decide how many councillors in each ward. The constraints in the Act is that they've got to be spread equally within a plus or minus 10% margin. So it's up to the representation review. It's not totally a council decision. It's the council makes a proposal, then there are submissions, there's a final proposal, and then appeals and objections go to the Local Government Commission.
I know, but the submission question, I just asking why the voter there only can have 1 vote for only 1 candidate, but we can have 1 or up to 2 votes for each or 2 councillors. The difference.
I'm not sure I understand the issue. Yeah.
As I understand it, I mean, in some wards we have, as in your own council, we have two councillors, and there was a suggestion, I think, when we did our last representation review in Manukau, that we, maybe we divide the ward up, and it went through that process, and the view was from submissions and from the local boards, I think, not to do so. But you can make that choice to make that part of the representation review, and the next review, Warwick, is
2024.
2024. So year after next. So if you were of a mind to change that, a suggestion can be made to make that as part of the representation review in 2024, Councillor.
Thank you. If I can read that.
Thank you. Second question is Councillor Desley-Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Warwick, thank you very much for your work on this. It's significant. Look, my question always comes locally is, you know, why is the Ōrākei ward and the Ōrākei local board areas different? Because I know of population. Is there any, what's minor? Is there a definition of minor? You talked about the Royal Oak example where potentially there's a tweaking of 1,300. Obviously, there's a lot more in that western side of my ward that doesn't allow a line with the local board boundaries. Is there no way we can do more to align local board boundaries and local ward boundaries to keep them more consistent?
A significant change to boundaries would need to be dealt with under the proposed new provisions in Schedule 3A, the reorganisation provisions. I understand where you're coming from, Councillor, and I recall that you and I met with the Newmarket and Parnell Business Associations, and they had requested that there be that alignment, but there would be too great a population change to simply do that as a minor change through a representation review.
Okay, I might have a chat to you offline. I'm just looking for the rules to back that up, you know? I mean, it's always tricky, isn't it? You know, when your ward and your board boundaries are different, and I understand the population, but population areas, but I just didn't know whether the new bill had numbers in it for minor and more than minor.
Now, what the
noting
bill,
that Royal Oak was...
Through you, Your Worship, what the bill does have in it is that number will be in the regulations, not in the bill itself.
Okay, got that, thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Councillor Pipakoon.
Kia ora Mayor, tēnā koe Warwick. Thank you for this. I have a great deal of confidence when you bring advice to us and with your drafting on the submission, so thank you for postponing your retirement for our benefit. I'm very grateful. My question's really more a formal question because I totally support the substance of the submission, but I always find it useful with a submission that we have a table that says proposal, response, and I just wondered within if the Mayor and Deputy Mayor were minded to support that kind of presentation, whether the feedback that we're giving suits that kind of presentation, because I just think it's quite hard when you're trying to, you know, in terms of what's public facing, to pull out the bits that are support. So I would welcome your advice on that, and of course, you know, if it's just not doable or within the time frame or not desirable, totally understand too, but I just thought I'd mention it as it's kind of my feedback when I've been delegated to comment on submissions. Kia ora.
Your Worship, it does make some sense in terms of readability, but in our particular case, we're basically supporting everything, so I'm not sure what the table would look like.
Yeah.
It's not, well, you're supporting some as with additional advice, so it just means you support the comment is, and then it just means you can really see it clearly what is the substance of the submission. But I leave that for the for you and the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to consider, just a personal preference of how I like to digest a submission. Kia ora.
Yeah, I think basically when I flick through the submission, usually in the first line it indicates that we support, and then there's a couple of areas there where Warwick is proposing that we should tweak it a little bit, but the changes aren't hugely substantial. They may be useful, and you know, because this is to a degree about Auckland, the Select Committee might be of a mind to adopt those tweaks. Councillor Linda Cooper, last question.
Thank you. It is around the area of Māori representation. You talk about financial implications in 61, 62, 63. In my mind, two people trying to represent the interests of all Māori across the region, seems to me that support that we get as councillors is not going to cut it. Like, you know, two councillors sharing one or two people is not going to support a Māori representatives, because they're going to have huge workload. It's almost going to be like they're going to be at a mayoral level, because there's so much there, right? You know, is that, in your comments there, they're kind of quite, you know, generic. Is that being thought about? Because I just think throwing one or two people into something as big as that is going to need a huge amount of support.
Your Worship, just a couple of comments on that. Firstly, there are some issues around that are being discussed through the current engagement process with mana whenua and Matawaka. So we've got 19 iwi hapu, and there's an issue there for them as to how would two people represent them. In terms of the actual number, Auckland Council is the largest authority in New Zealand. At the moment, we'd only be entitled to one.
Exactly.
And
that poor person.
At face value, that doesn't look quite right. And when you dig down into the calculations, we've got approximately 11.5 or 12% of the population are Māori, but the formula that's used basically uses about 6% because it takes into account the number on the Māori roll. We would have at least one or two additional members if it was just based on the population of people of Māori descent. So there are those issues as well. But the formula that applies to our situation is the same formula that applies to the parliamentary arrangements.
Thank you. The question, if you'll indulge, it is around remuneration, and this isn't obviously to the Remuneration Authority, but we've been told that if we have extra councillors, particularly Māori wards, then it'll be the same pool. So I don't know what your view is, but I'm just wondering, you know, that seems like, oh, when you get Māori councillors, well, you're going to get paid less, which to me seems a little bit of an insult, really. It's saying, oh, when you get there, you're going to get paid less than what the councillors got paid last term, so too bad. And we all will, and that's the way it is. But I just think that, I don't know if there's any, you know, I think that we need to, if we're going to attract good people who want to take on a huge role, and especially for the one Māori representative, it's like being the mayor for Māori across Tamaki Makaurau. It's a massive job, will require a lot of support if they're going to be effective, and then they get paid less than we even get paid now. And how do you attract people? And that's the reality of people of good calibre that might be giving up a job, you know, remunerated much more highly than that now. You just don't get people that can afford to do it. So I don't know whether you can do anything in this submission, but or if we ever get an opportunity to talk to the Remuneration Authority. But I just think that's, yeah, it goes counter, and Rose is here because she's working on it, Rosaline, it goes counter to my understanding that we want to encourage people to do these jobs, not discourage them. Thank you. That was a bit of a comment and a question, sorry.
Yeah, I
won't
doubt
speak
in
to
the
it.
submission we can address that problem, but either Warwick or Rose might want to comment on it. If we increase the number of councillors, as would be in my mind if I were here, to 23, which would give us 2 Māori councillors, that still works out of the same pool of remuneration, which would mean that councillors would have to take a cut in income, which does appear to be counterintuitive given the size of the task we have with the population that's served. But Rose, I presume you've come on screen to comment on that, so shall I go to you first and then back to Warwick?
I have. Thank you, Mayor Fowle, and great question. This is something we have been asked to look at and will with the Remuneration Authority. Previously, their advice has been to us that the size of the job of governing Auckland doesn't get bigger just because you add more elected members. But that was kind of advice given quite early on in the piece, and I think it's worth challenging a little bit and having a discussion with the Rem Authority on, because conversely, having an extra person there doesn't make the job less for you all. So, and Councillor Cooper points out some other issues that are really important. How do you support somebody who's covering, you know, half or the whole of Auckland? What does that look like? And Warwick's quite right, Māori in our engagement with them have been talking to us just about how difficult that job would be and who would be attracted to it. So we'll pick it up with the Rem Authority and consider it. It is a management decision, of course, how we, you know, the number of support officers we give to elected members. So that's, you know, something for consideration further down the track.
So what I'm hearing, real issue, but can't be addressed through these submissions, would have to be taken to the Remuneration Authority. New head of that's a guy called Jeff Summers, whom I know. So I think there's a good case to take it to them, but not appropriate, Warwick, to include that in this submission.
No, it's not relevant to the bill, Your Worship.
So, good point, but needs to be taken up through a different channel.
But just to, perhaps if I could add to what Rose has said, and just to emphasise that this is not an issue to do with Māori representation, it's an issue to do with how the Remuneration Authority at the moment determines what people are paid. And it might be of interest to members. There was at Wellington City Council not so long ago, a member resigned, and that left one less member for the pool. So they all had to receive an additional amount in their salary. And they objected to that and made a complaint using a lawyer to the Parliament Select Committee that has the oversight of regulatory bodies. And there were submissions by the Remuneration Authority as well, and the Select Committee decided it was that the Remuneration Authority wasn't stepping outside the bounds of the legislation it was required to work under. But it does seem counterintuitive, as you say, Your Worship.
Yep, I think the pooling idea is dumb, frankly, but that's got to be dealt with by the new council in a different arena. I now have another question, Councillor Al Filipaina.
Tēnā koe, Your Worship, tēnā korua Warwick ko Rose, ngā mihi kia korua o te mahi. So look, Your Worship, you ended up commenting on what I wanted to ask the partai was about, and that's in regards to 21-22 increasing the councillors. But Warwick and Rose, look, can you just advise me that the bill just allows us to increase our numbers from 20, and then it's up to the governing body to decide by how many?
That's correct, yes. That will happen during the representation review.
Yes, yeah. But the bill just allows us to increase the numbers on the governing body, Warwick.
Yes.
Yep, we can take it up to 29, I think, can't we, theoretically, if we want 29 councillors. I've read the bill, Your Worship, and I know that 23 is the number that allows us, as you pointed out, 2 Māori wards. So Warwick, the other partai for me is once we end up deciding, once the bill goes through, when will be the first opportunity for us to end up making that decision? And when I say yes, the incoming council.
The decision about Māori representation is, under this bill, is a two-step one. First, by a date on the 20th of December, I think it is, in 2023, there needs to be a decision as to whether or not to have Māori representation. If the council decides to have Māori representation, then it must provide for it in its representation arrangement proposal. And the representation arrangement review is carried out through 2024.
Yeah, the question was, if the bill goes through, which
yes.
I'm hoping, and I have no doubt, a few other people, if that goes, sorry, if that goes through,
yes.
When will be the first opportunity for the incoming council to decide on the numbers that we wish to increase the council governing body by? Would it be in the first year of the new term, or would it, yeah, and that's increasing the numbers, not about Māori representation.
Oh, Your Worship, yes. So the legislation requires the first proposal of the council to be publicly notified. I think it's August in 2024. So we've got up until then to figure out what our proposal is going to be. We will need to put a paper to the governing body next year proposing a process. And if the process is similar to the process we used last time, the process will include local boards.
I think I'm confusing you, Warwick. Sorry, Your Worship. Warwick, just to try and get to what I'm trying to say is, when will the bill, if it goes through Parliament, when will it become law?
Oh, we probably don't know that yet, but I imagine that because we've only got a narrow window of opportunity to make these changes, that they'll want to try and get it through by the end of this year. But I'm saying that just as a presumption, Councillor, not as something that I've been informed. I don't know. Warwick, have you had any indication of when they might want to pass it by?
That seems to be in line with the cabinet papers that the ministers put. Your Worship,
Yeah.
By the end of the year.
And
Yeah, so that would leave you between February and August of next year for the new governing body to make decisions around that. So that's the time frame we're looking at, Warwick, I think.
February and August 2024.
Yep. Oh, February and August 2024. Okay, that's a longer period of time. Sorry, I'm thinking it's next year. That makes it a lot more comfortable. Yep.
Oh, I mean, the indication talking to the Minister for Local Government is that, yes, he wants the bill passed by the end of the year. So that's with our conversations we've had through Te Marawata. But that's why, okay, it's 2024. Look, thank you, Your Worship, and I'll just wait for whakaata. Kia ora.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Yes, it was relating to Councillor Filipaina's question. Do we have a representation review scheduled? Because that seems to be the time when we should be looking at 23 councillors and where do they serve. Yes. We could be carving up wards in fairly large way with 3 more councillors. So, yeah, when's our timing on that?
That will happen throughout 2024, and as I've mentioned, the first deadline, I think, is about August 2024, where we have to publicly notify the first proposal.
Right, that brings questions to an end. Now a chance for any comments. First comment from Councillor Filipaina.
Kia ora, Worship, and thank you again to the staff. Your Worship, it's taken us a while, but we've got back to the situation we had previously when the recommendation from the working group was put to the governing body and also with the Independent Māori Statutory Board. I'm glad we're at this situation now where we'll be putting this submission. Your Worship, the only one partai for you in regards to F, if you could include myself, depending if I'm around that table. I know it's called nominees, but I'm making the offer now to end up appearing in front of the select committee if that happens, obviously prior to the elections being completed. Your Worship, the reason I'm asking that is because since 2010 and the amalgamation, I have been, albeit half a kasi, I've been half all the way through in regards to Māori representation. So just wanted to put that out there in regards to F in regard about the submission. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Alf. Yeah, look, I'll note that as an expression of interest to be part of the process. Thank you. Next comment from Councillor Shane Henderson.
Thank you. That came around pretty quickly. Yeah, firstly, I want to say, look, I really support Councillor Filipina as being included, and if it's okay with the Mayor and the meeting. You know, I've seen being involved in the Joint Governance Working Party and then being involved in the Māori wards discussions with Councillor Alf. I've seen some of the passion that he brings to that discussion, so I'm pretty happy with that if we can do that. You know, I really support this. I'm really happy that the government are actually listening to us and our advocacy that we've done for many, many years on this. It's just a really delightful feeling that they're acting on exactly what we wanted. But I don't want to lose that point from Councillor Cooper around the wages issue. You know, there's a philosophical issue here that when wages get lower, that makes it harder for working class people to stand for election. Eventually down the line, you have a body of independently wealthy councillors that bring that worldview to the table that is, you know, a loss for the entire city. So I think we need to be always keeping that in mind, and I would encourage staff to really push on that issue. It's not a self-interested issue, it's just this sort of city that I want to see in the future needs to be representative of the people. The other thing is I don't want any votes against Māori wards to be based on side issues that aren't directly related to the direct elected representation of our partners in Te Tiriti. And that is a side issue that I think people might pick up and say, oh, look, what about the wages thing? So we've just got to sort that. The other side issue that we have been talking about is the size of our council and how many councillors we have. And so this directly addresses one of those points. So if we can address the other one, I'm hoping that we're going to come back and we're going to endorse everything wholesale and get Māori wards sorted. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Look, I have no further comments registered with me, just a couple from myself. While F talks about the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, it also talks about all their nominees. And I haven't talked to the Deputy Mayor about this, but it seems to make sense to me that councillors that will be represented around the table in the new council should be the ones that make the submission. So I'm happy if there are further indications of interest in that for Councillor Filipina to be one of the nominees and any other councillor that has a strong interest in that regard. Secondly, I take it that everybody is in favour of the submission as drafted. You've had a chance to look at that, so that will be the basis of the submission given. Thirdly, while it doesn't spell out what the nature of our future arrangements would be, I've picked up a sense that because of the size of our city, having 23 councillors, in other words, 3 more than what we currently have, would be perfectly reasonable and would allow for the representation of 2 Māori wards, which makes the task of the Māori ward representative much easier than trying for one person to represent the whole of the city. And I know the challenges that are faced by Māori members of Parliament with huge electorates extending geographically over, you know, I think the member for Southern Māori is Te Taitonga, covers the whole of the South Island and part of Wellington. So while geographically they're not that extended, it would be a real challenge for a Māori member to represent the whole of the city in that way. But that will be a matter for the new council to consider. And on the question of remuneration, my personal view, I've got no vested interest in this obviously, is the concept of a pool where you reduce the payment if you increase the number of councillors bears no relationship to the workload and the ability to attract the people with the capacity, the talent and the energy that we need around the council table. So that will be an issue for the new council to address as well. But my personal view is that a councillor that's working full-time, meeting his or her constituents' needs as well as participating in the responsibilities of being a member of committee and doing the job properly and thoroughly, there is a case for better remuneration at that level. It should not be, as Councillor Henderson said, something that you go to as a retired person that is independently well off and doesn't rely on it. I think the more people we can attract around this table that are representative of the cross-section of our society, including those raising young kids with big mortgages, the pay rate needs to be attractive enough to enable those people to put the 50 or 60 hours a week that they need to put into the job to do it thoroughly and meet their other financial responsibilities. So that's my comment as an outgoing representative of this table, around this table, without an axe to grind on it. So it's time to put the motions, the recommendations to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I declare that carried, and I think carried unanimously.